Welcome to the Purple Ship. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Tonya. And this is where we talk about the remarkable process of creating.
And we meet people who have shipped remarkable things. And our guest today is Tonya Cole. Hello, Tonya. It's so happy to have you here. And then we're curious about your project. What is your book about?
Hi, Amanda. My book, glad to be here. My book is about, I would call it a memoir hybrid.
Mm,
And it's really about my journey discovering my great grandmother. What I found through the years growing up, we had a family book, and everything that was in that book was about the men in our family, all these pioneer stories. And there was literally only about 3 sentences about my great grandmother. And she died before my father was born, so nobody knew anything about her. And I felt very compelled to give her a voice. I had never paid attention to her before, but that book got me thinking, what about the women? And they needed a voice. And so that's how I came upon creating this book.
your book is titled The Questioning, Finding Truth Between Worlds. And then I think this is very interesting when you talk about like the story you read is all about men in the family, and you would like to have your women ancestors a voice. So tell us the story behind the story you wrote.
Well, a lot of that is there wasn't a lot of stories behind the story. Mainly the stories, like I said, was about the male ancestors. And even my father, because she died before he was born, he had no memory of her. His big sister, who's now in her 90s, she had no memory. So what I found was I just started documenting myself talking to my father, talking to my aunt about this. And then her name was Fanny, my great grandmother. And then what I had to start doing was imagining her life and imagining what she went through. And I believe that's what really made a transformation in me, where this book went from a simple project that I wanted to do in writing and community to really a labor of love that I still created in writing and community, but I could see so much more of the gift in this.
Right. And it sounds like it actually started with intention to create a story for your ancestors and explore. But then when I look at the title of your book, The Questioning, it seems like you actually have a lot of questions. So how did you put it all the pieces together since it seems like they were not a lot of information and stories when you first started.
There really wasn't. In this family book that I grew up with, this was written by my great aunt and published in the 60s. And I always thought it was really cool that we had a family book, but whenever I tried to read it, it was very disjointed. And I know now because she just had people send her stories. So a lot of times a story might be a paragraph or
Mm,
just a couple sentences. And you go into it thinking it's going to read like a novel, and it just doesn't. And so, like I said, my first thought was, oh, I'm just going to expand on these stories. And then I realized like there's a little story about a wagon train because my great grandmother traveled to the West in a wagon train at 5 years old. And there's so little about it, but it sent me down a road of doing a whole story about a wagon train and and that really started me imagining them. And I kind of backed off the wagon train a little bit, but I started imagining, like, for example, my great grandmother, she was promised great grandfather in marriage as an infant.
mm,
So and so that's where I also really wondered, where is her voice
mm.
and what about her choices in life? And so she grew up in Santa Barbara, California, married my great grandfather, and then promptly moved to Montana. And in the family book, it says they lived in a tent next to a slaughterhouse. in their early years, and that's all it says. And so I thought, wow, what a shock. Here's this gal in her 20s with a man she probably doesn't really know that well, and they're living in a tent. And as I researched more, I saw that during those couple years, there was probably one of the worst blizzards of at least the decade that in Montana that year, where we're talking 40 below. And anyway, so I wanted to imagine like what was that like? And the surprising transformation that I also found was my great grandfather. A lot of the stories about him are that he really wasn't the nicest guy. I don't know that I would say he was abusive, but he wasn't a great guy. And but what I also saw was it gave me a little more compassion for him because I could see the world he was living in and the world she was living in. It's a world of strength. I mean, to winter in Montana and run a homestead, you have to be strong. And so it just gave me a lot of insight. And so there's just been so much with this book and seeing how important our ancestors are, which that was something I also didn't realize.
Hmm.
And what I've discovered since is there's actually studies, there's a study out that thinking about your ancestors, reading about them actually improves your cognitive thinking. So, so I spent 2 years doing that. So my brain should giving me good exercise.
That's a good one. That's a very good information. So when you talk about the transformation, because like I said, you are piecing all the stories together. You did the research. So you talk about the transformation, the transformation of you getting to know them and your grandfather. And also, I'm very curious if you find this book will be impactful for your own children as well and for the readers.
I think so. One of the things I know right now, my kids, I have twin teenagers who just turned 16, and right now they're not really that interested in it. But I understand that when I was 16, I wasn't that interested in my ancestry. But I also know this is going to be a gift for them in the future, for their children, long after I'm gone. Um, but also the transformation in this too is, and now this was another unexpected thing, was that since it's been published and I've talked with people, friends and other people who've read it, what it really does is it sparks their own imagination and their own thoughts about their ancestors. And that feels really exciting. Because it brings up a gift. And even now, when I look at my great aunt's book, where before we always thought, well, it's not that great, but really I think of what a gift. Because if she hadn't written that book, I wouldn't have had anything to go on. So, really, in a way, anything we can do with our ancestors is a gift for the future. And it also just makes me think about um, one day we will be ancestors as well, and what kind of ancestors do we want to be? How do we
That
want
is,
to go down in the annals? So,
yeah, well, that kind of leads us uh, to see the future, right? It's like they
mhm.
become the ancestors of our younger generation. That's actually pretty profound. And at the same time, have you always been a writer? We know the questioning, finding truth between the worlds is your debut book. And then have you always been an author? Have you always been enjoying writing? And how did it all start? I know you have a story you want to share, but I'm just curious about the whole process. How did it start?
Well, I have always written, and this is my first book. I've never written a full book before, but I've always written for work, for our business. A lot of times it was writing articles on gardening, blog posts. I had a mommy blog for a while, and of course, tons of journaling. But also, what was challenging with this was Well, I have a lot of roles in my life. So I'm a wife, I'm a mother, and we also have dogs. My husband and I run a business. So, and with teenagers, it's just very busy. So this book really was created, was written on the fringes of all of that. So, and I believe too, what was really helpful in it, and also with being in writing and community, is it helped me develop a regular practice of
Mhm.
writing, not just when I had time or when I was feeling creative, because there was lots of times I did not feel creative, but I would even just sit down for 15 minutes and I was able to carve it out. And that's why it did take me a couple years. It probably took me a good 2 years to write this book, 18 months to 2 years,
Mhm.
and another 6 months to do the production on it.
Right.
As opposed to, I don't know how it would be if I was writing it 8 hours a day, but yeah.
Well, you talk about, it's a gift, for the people who are reading it, even also for your own family. The process of creating this book is also, of course, a part of the shipping of this project, this book. Um, what have you learned? Any key learnings you have when you are producing, creating, writing this book? Can you share with us, with the audience? Because I believe many of them are in the journey, doing this right now. Yeah.
Yes, there's probably so many things that I learned that that could be a whole episode, but some of the key things um, was, well, on one hand, the biggest thing I think was not using Amazon's free ISBN, which I used that my first time through. And I think that was also because I didn't realize I wasn't exactly clear on the goal of my book. And so I would say that's important. And at that time, I thought, I want to just get this published. I'm just going to use the free Amazon one because they make it very easy. And, but later, when I wanted to do some other promotional things for the book, I wasn't able to. I can't get it into our local bookstore and I can't get it into the library because it's Amazon's ISBN. And so that's probably a pretty obvious thing to learn. But so I'm in the process of doing a second edition. I'm writing an afterword and I've purchased some ISBN numbers. And so then I can do more with it.
Mm.
And so I would say that was probably the most important thing that I learned. And in terms of production, I switched about halfway through the book. I started it in Microsoft Word. And then about halfway through, I switched it over to Scrivener, which I really do like Scrivener. And I know I'm probably only just using the basics of it. And I did try the compile function and it worked okay. Um, I wanted to make it a little more, I wanted to have more finesse over the typography and the chapter headings. And so I did it in Adobe InDesign. And I used to be a graphic designer years ago, so I have experience in InDesign. So I wouldn't say for anybody, it is a more difficult program, but that made me feel good because I had more control over everything. And I did the cover with that and Photoshop too. But then the ebook, I could not get InDesign to make a good ebook. I just used Kindle Create, which is very simple. But I
Mm.
did that after. And in hindsight, I think I should have done the ebook first, but I didn't. I feel like I've kind of done everything the hard way because it's my first time, and that's okay. So I feel like this was going to school too, in
Mm.
a way, because there's so much that I learned that I can use on the next time.
Well, those are very important points for everyone who's actually on a journey. If you are writing a book, this is talking about ISBN, talking about what program to use, and then should you start the ebook first, and then things will go from there, and then you can have some flexibility. Well, thank you, Tonya, for sharing that with us. And then with this book out, obviously, what's the change you want to make with this book?
Well, I would say the change I want to make in the world with this book,
Mhm.
that's always the big question, is I think this book can really get people thinking about their own family narratives more and their own ancestors. And even if, I know sometimes there's people I've talked to who are adopted and they don't know their history, their DNA history. Um, but I also realized too in writing this, my great grandmother's mother was not her biological mother, because her bio mom, her biological mother died when she was a baby. And I think we forget that that happened so much back then, of young mothers passing away and different mothers stepping in, second wives. But also, I guess the change I'd want to make in the world with this is, yeah, for people to feel a way that there's a way that they can get closer to their ancestors by either stepping into their world, imagining their stories, and seeing how that affects them today. Because it does, my experience has been, it really gives you perspective on your own life.
Right. Because it seems like there's so many things you have done research on, and then you put it into the story. It's almost like you need to make a bridge to bridge that gap, the things you cannot find. Do you consider this in the categories of family history? And I'm just curious, how would you define the book? And it's obviously it's not fiction, but how do you bridge that? Can you touch
Well,
on that?
that's always been a challenge for me in this book, because on one hand, technically some of it would be historical fiction and some of it would be nonfiction. So that's why I keep thinking it's almost a new genre. I don't know, a hybrid memoir. And and after the book has been published, I'm seeing so much other authors, talking about, stepping into the ancestors' world. And when we imagine our stories or their stories, it really gives us much more insight into the people that they were, rather than just the dates that they were born, where they lived, what year they died. Um, and so I suppose I would call it family history. And I feel like in my book, I was very clear when I was imagining something. The reader knows that. So I'm not trying to pass off, a different family history than what really occurred. So I feel like my hope is that it leads people to ponder.
I like that. When I read your book, you have a way to describe things. It's almost you lead us into almost like a movie scene, and then to read your words, and then to really explore your story with you, and that's beautiful. And then I think it's quite creative to be able to piece the truths, the facts, and then with whatever missing information you have, but pieces all together. So thank you. That is so important. The questioning, finding truth between worlds. So obviously this book is out, and then what's next for you? It seems like there are more for you to do. And what are you working on now?
I'm working on now is, of course, re-releasing the questioning, but I'm also working on, my mother passed away in June last summer. And so she had a stroke. So I really was documenting that as that was happening. And so that feels like an important project for my second book, just to get that out there. And there's a lot that I learned with that. And again, that's in the theme of family. And so it does seem like those really resonate with me. So that's my current project.
Yes. So people are curious about your work, the questioning, the book, and where can they find you and connect with you if they have questions and they want to explore more with the work, important work you do?
Well, they can reach me on Instagram, and it's Tonya L. Cole on Instagram, and that'll be up in the interview. And you can purchase the book on Amazon.
Right. And then we're
So they'll be
looking,
that as well.
yeah, and then we're looking forward to more of your projects coming and sharing with us. So thank you so much, Tanya, for sharing your book, the questioning, finding truth between worlds with us today and your shipping process and all the things you have learned in between. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. This was a lot of fun.